The circle can be broken into 4 quadrants. The first quadrant here is between 0 and 90 degrees. The second quadrant is between 90 and 180 degrees. The third quadrant is between 180 and 270 degrees. And the fourth quadrant is between 270 and 360 degrees. Now, in the examples that we have looked at so far, we've only covered the values for our sine, cos and our tan within this first quadrant. That is for values between 0 and 90 degrees. So let's go ahead and we'll look and see how each of the functions, sine, cos and tan, change depending on which quadrant of the circle that we are in. We will start off with the sine function. Now we're going to work our way around the circle in an anti-clockwise direction, and you can see here that the sine function is being produced, and we have the value for our sine function here. Now in this example we have a radius of 1, so it means that the height of our sine function won't get any higher than a value of +1 or -1. So at the moment we're in the first quadrant between 0 and 90 degrees. And we know that the sine function is going to be given by the ratio of our y height here divided by the hypotenuse here, which we can call r. So the sine is y divided by r. Now the y height here is positive. The value for our r isn't positive or negative. To talk about this r as being positive or negative makes no sense. The only thing that we're interested in here is the value for our y. So the y value is positive, and you can see here that the value for our sine function is a positive value. Now as we get up towards 90 degrees, that's us hit the 90 degrees here and we're inside the first quadrant. Now we're going to go from the first quadrant to the second quadrant. Now when we do that, you can see here that the y value is still a positive value. So it means that the value for our sine is still positive. So this height here is a positive height. Now as we work our way along this, we get to the junction between the second and the third quadrant. So you can see that the sine function is positive in the first and the second quadrant. Now when we go into the third quadrant, we can see that the value for our y now becomes negative. And you can see here we have a negative height here. So it means that the value for our sine in the third quadrant is negative. And you can see here up here we've got the value of minus 0.999. Whenever we go into the fourth quadrant, you can see again that the y value is still negative. So it means that the sine function is negative in the fourth quadrant. So you can see from the function here that the sine function is positive in the first and second quadrants and negative in the third and fourth quadrants. Now we don't have to memorise this. I will show you an acronym that we're going to work out so that we can remember these. But that covers the sine function. Let's move on and we'll look at the cosine function. The cosine function is given by the ratio of the x distance divided by the r. Now the x distance here is a positive value. So you can see that the cosine function within the first quadrant is a positive function. As we move into the second quadrant, you can see here now the x value is now negative. And you can see that the function here is now negative and we have a value of minus 0.555. So it means that in the first quadrant the cosine is positive, and in the second quadrant the cosine is negative. And then when we move into the third quadrant, you can see here that the x value is still negative. We're going from this point here to this point here, which is a negative value. And then whenever we move into the fourth quadrant, you can see that the x value now is positive. So the cosine function is positive in the fourth quadrant. So we can see here that the cosine function is positive in the first quadrant and in the fourth quadrant, and it's negative in the second and the third. So let's look at the tan function. The tan function is given by the ratio of the y divided by the x. Now in the first quadrant the y is positive and the x is positive, so you've got a positive divided by a positive, which is just a positive number, and you can see here that the value for our tan here is positive 1.0296. Now whenever we head into the second quadrant, you can see now that the y value is still positive, but the x value is negative. So we've got a positive divided by a negative, which gives you a negative value. And you can see here that the tan function is negative in this quadrant. When we move into the third quadrant, you can see here that we're going to have a negative value for the y and a negative value for the x. So we'll have a negative divided by a negative, which will give us a positive. And you can see here that in the third quadrant that the tan function is now positive. When we head into the fourth quadrant, you can see we're going to have a negative for the y and we're going to have a positive for the x. So we'll have a negative divided by a positive, which gives us a negative value. So the tan function in this fourth quadrant is negative. So you can see in the first quadrant the tan is positive, and the third quadrant the tan is positive. In the second and the fourth quadrant the tan is negative. So how are we going to remember all of these? Well, we have a very simple acronym which we will describe now. So let's look at all of our functions together. Now this graph is going to look a little bit busy, but let's just take it one quadrant at a time. You can see here in the first quadrant that all of the functions are positive. So the sine function in blue here takes on all positive values. The cosine function here takes on all positive values, and the tan function takes on all positive values. So in this first quadrant, the functions are all positive. So we could put an A here, meaning all positive. Now if we move into the next quadrant, you can see here that we're going to have the sine function, which is in blue, is positive. And the other two functions, the cosine and the tan, are negative. So the only function that is positive in this quadrant is the sine function. So we could put an S in here. So S stands for the sine function being positive. When we move into the third quadrant, you can see here that the only function that is positive is the tan function. The sine and the cosine are both negative. So in this third quadrant, the tan function is positive. And finally, in the fourth quadrant, you can see that the only function that is positive is the cosine function. The sine function and the tan function are both negative. So in the fourth quadrant, we can say that the cosine function is positive. So I have a little acronym And my acronym is All Sinners Take Care. And if I remember, starting from the first quadrant to the second quadrant to the third quadrant to the fourth quadrant, that all, the A stands for all of the functions are positive. Sinners, the S stands for the sign function being positive. Take, that is the T, is the tan function is positive. And care, that's the C, which is the cosine function, is positive. Of course, you can create your own acronym in order to remember these. But if you get stuck and you forget these, then if you're able to draw out the sine, the cosine and the tan function, you can always work them out for yourself, because now you understand exactly where these positive and negative values come from.